So recently, I did a video briefly summarizing the new LA City Ordinance 1877-37, which is kind of dubbed the non-RSO rent control, which if you need a briefer on that, I will link somewhere up here, maybe at the end card, a link to that video and you can watch that and then you'll have some sort of a briefer brush up on that ordinance. And live that ordinance coming out, which basically made rent control applicable to houses, condos, and multifamily that wasn't otherwise rent controlled. I've been getting quite a few inquiries about buyouts, so I thought I would do kind of an update on what buyouts look like in 2023. In short, they look the same as they looked for a very long time. Now I just do probably slightly more buyouts on houses. During COVID, there was a lot of restrictions on doing evictions for houses. You really couldn't end tenancies. People were, sheltering in place. So I did quite a few buyouts on houses where the tenants were willing to move out and the owners were either going to move back in or more commonly owners were going to sell the houses. Now the market looks slightly different. So selling houses, kind of a different vibe. Time for doing this video. We have a market that is kind of stabilizing. We have interest rates that continue to go up because the Fed keeps hiking rates. For some people, they're holding on to real estate and other people are just selling because they gotta sell. So with this new ordinance, it's made it where you can't evict tenants that are living in like condos, houses. Those are the two main properties that were being sold during COVID that needed buyouts that pre-COVID would have not needed them. If they were a month-to-month tenancy, you would have ended the month-to-month and that would have been that. So that's the main change that's happened or like an update for 2023 is you just have to do more buyouts. I don't think that's necessarily like a crazy thing. The reason why I don't think it's a crazy thing is because the alternative to a tenant not moving out is an eviction route. And evictions are not my favorite. I don't do evictions because they're just not my jam. They are tedious and stressful for literally everybody involved. They stress the attorneys out. They stress the tenants out. They stress the landlords out. They stress the courts out. Buyouts tend to be the most amicable way to have tenants voluntarily move out. I've said this before in a few other videos that I've done on buyouts. I don't think buyouts are inherently bad. Tenants have the choice to agree or not agree. So in that sense, I think buyouts are fine. Now, going into the common reasons why one does a buyout is that they're more favorable terms simply for the landlord. That's the incentive for the landlord, and that's why the landlord pays a premium on them, is there far less strings attached. There are definitely requirements that you have to abide by. A lot of cities in LA County, actually in California, but I predominantly work in LA County, so that's why I know a lot about LA County. They have certain requirements. Tenants have certain rights to cancel the agreement. The agreements in some places have to be filed. So there's certain things that you want to make sure that you're adhering to. So those requirements have kind of always been the same. Those haven't really changed. The reasons that you do buyouts have pretty much been the same. If you bought a property and you want to redevelop it, demolish and redevelop, buyouts. I do a lot of those kind of buyouts. Buyouts for just like owner occupier. A landlord might want to owner occupy for a year, but there might be restrictions on how long they have to occupy. So they might be willing to pay a premium to have the tenant voluntarily move out so that they can move in and be able to, situate themselves. Another one is if they're going to sell the property, tends to make the property slightly more valuable. Now, the thing that I will say is when doing buyouts is there's always a balance. People have buyout budgets, for instance, because the value to buyout price varies. There's a point where paying for a buyout doesn't make sense. Going the eviction route and dealing with the legal expenses, the time delay, the potential loss in income still makes more sense than paying a really high buyout. So there's all sorts of factors that a landlord takes into consideration on that. That being said, a lot of buyouts get done. I've seen that buyouts are getting done for pretty reasonable prices. Tenants are pretty happy with the amount of money that they're getting. And another main buyout, which I think is going to be even more common than it already was, is for tenants that racked up COVID debt and have no means to pay it, because to basically pay back COVID debt, if you just weren't paying your rent, will require you to pay double rent for the next year. So that's another very common one where a tenant has racked up a huge debt and the landlord's willing to forgive some some or all of it in exchange for the tenant moving out. That's a very common deal. I've made a number of those deals. Now that the eviction moratoriums are coming close to an end, I project to be way more common. In that sense, that's the update on what buyouts look like in 2023. I would say putting yourself in kind of a tenant's shoes. If the tenant is delinquent and really delinquent, a buyout probably would be a good bet for the tenant because they're going to be likely getting that debt forgiven and walked away from, and it avoids the eviction court. And it's, something that the landlord's able to continue to mitigate the losses from rent that they're not collecting. In that sense, for a tenant, if you're a tenant that owes a lot of back due rent, before your landlord maybe serves you a 3-day notice or starts doing a small claims proceeding or some sort of legal proceeding to collect that, you might want to potentially offer up to your landlord that you will, that kind of deal. So again, I've said it before, tenants can also propose some sort of buyout agreement. So if you're a tenant that has that might be something that you might want to consider. For landlords, a lot of the cities have already kind of come up with what they deem as relocation. So that's kind of, a benchmark for what would be considered reasonable. There's all sorts of other factors into buyouts. There's no one way fits all for everybody. Every buyout situation is completely independent and, very unique to itself. But I do think in light of the new ordinance and in light of COVID eviction moratorium protections coming to an end, I do think that buyouts are definitely going to be more popular, and I think are going to be far more appealing for both sides, for landlords and tenants. So that is my take on buyouts in 2023. Thanks.